This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 472, entitled The Masculist Takeover of Gender Politics. Description. This flyer provides a blueprint on how masculists can take over gender politics, stripping the feminists of their monopoly over gender political ideology for the past 6 decades. The flyer itself. The Masculist Takeover of Gender Politics by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer provides a blueprint on how the masculists can take over gender politics to make the world men fair and to stop the feminazis from indirectly wiping out whole populations via their control of the divorce courts and making women so repulsive to men that men refuse even to fuck them. This flyer begins by showing the enormous damage that modern feminism has done to the world, thus motivating the masculist takeover of gender politics to save the planet from wiping itself out. Modern day feminism is toxic. It's both hypocritical and indirectly genocidal and has to be stopped, defeated, crushed by masculist ideas so that men, with their 10% larger brains, their male genius, can restore the planet to a sustainable state. I give a bit of history as to how the feminists have taken control of gender politics and how the masculists can take it back from them and why that needs to happen. It was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine, household gadgets, higher education, a life expectancy well into their 80s. The male-invented contraceptive pill that allows women to be able to choose reliably the number of kids they want, which is now typically 0, 1 or 2. With maximum only 2 kids in most cases, women in their 60s, found they had time in their hands once their second child was off to kindergarten, so got bored being housewives, wondering to themselves, is this all? That is, were they satisfied being housewives with no career challenge that their upper middle class husbands had? As a result, second wave feminism burst on the scene in the late 60s, so that today the large majority of women are now careerists, often earning as much as men, thus becoming FIPs, that is, financially independent persons. Women became feminists and pushed the politicians to vote in new laws that were more favourable to women. In particular, these second-wave feminists took over the divorce courts and changed the divorce laws to such a point that they actually became toxic for divorcing husbands. They were so favourable to women that in many Western countries today, women initiate about 70% of the divorces. During the past 6 decades, feminism has been largely the only gender political movement. So by default, nearly all women, as well as feminists, knew nothing about masculism, that is, the ideology for the liberation of men. So not surprisingly, kept their traditional, unquestioned expectations of men intact and brought them with them when they took over the divorce courts. They saw men as cash machines, put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. A deeply ingrained attitude that most women have. Since the widespread growth of the nuclear family, which resulted from the migration of millions of people from the farms to the factories during the Industrial Revolution, and with no contraception, nuclear families often had a dozen kids, most of whom survived due to superior medical knowledge and sewage systems, clean drinking water, etc. So, over a century ago, the housewife role of the mother was a full-time job. She had a dozen kids to look after, the cooking, the washing, the shopping, etc. She was definitely no shirker in those days. However, over the past century, things have changed radically. Now, women live into their 80s and thus have a career window of half a century. So the masculists are now telling women that they have a powerful moral obligation to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up. That is, become FIPs, that's financially independent persons. Or be considered by masculists to be manslavers and hence hated, since to masculists, fluffydom, in brackets, a fluffy, based on the word fluff, is a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life, close brackets, is manslavery, and hence slavery, and hence hated. So masculists have a hatred of fluffies and aim to wipe them out. But this masculinist attitude, this hatred of fluffies, is a relatively new social and political phenomenon. For several decades now, the feminists have had control of the divorce courts, bringing their mix of feminist and fluffy values with them. Since these feminists know nothing about masculinist ideas, they are labelled by the masculists as monoconscious. That is, they have only had one gender political consciousness raised, that is, feminist. Since they know nothing about masculism, they are not bi-conscious. That is, they have not had both their feminist and their masculinist consciousnesses raised. So by default, unconsciously, they still expect men to perform men's traditional male role of being the breadwinner for the nuclear family, with the wife, the mother, being a housewife, and hence being financially dependent, that is, parasitic, on the husband, the father, for his money. So, what happens when there's a divorce in the eyes of the monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges? Who pays for the now divorced mother? What happens to the kids? When the feminist organisation NOW, that's National Organisation for Women, was set up in the mid-60s in the US, its intellectual leaders, for example Betty Friedan, Bella Abzug, etc., proposed that custody of children after a divorce be made joint. That is, the divorcing parents both kept custody of the children. But there was such a backlash from the rank and file members of NOW, and it was such a divisive issue, that the leaders were forced to accept the majority view and reverse their policy on custody of kids in a divorce, pushing for sole custody of the children going to the mother. And this is what happened. But if the mother has sole custody of the kids, where will she and her kids live? Answer: in the house they previously lived in, that is, the divorcing husband, the father, lost his house that he paid for. Since a divorcing mother was usually not a FIP, how could she afford to pay for the kids she was raising in his house? From money given to her by her divorced husband, called alimony. How long should she be given alimony? Since the traditional gender roles were that the mother stayed at home with the kids and the father earned the money for decades, then these monoconscious feminists in charge of the divorce courts simply assumed that the divorced father would continue to pay for his now divorced ex-wife, with no moral nor legal obligations on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, so that she stopped parasiting off the money of her ex-husband. So men, divorcing men, got royally fucked over. They lost custody of their kids with a 90% probability. A divorcing man lost his house to his ex-wife so she could raise her kids in it. He lost half his stuff and wealth to her. He made child payments to her for his kids, whom he would barely see. Maybe 2 weekend visits a month. He would pay her alimony, often for life. So not surprisingly, given the modern toxicity of divorce for men, a massive backlash occurred with men, leading to the growth of the MGTOW movement, that is, men going their own way. That is, young men who saw the toxicity of the divorce courts, which financially massacred and destroyed the lives of their fathers, their uncles, their older male friends, and decided they would boycott marriage and paternity and spend their money on themselves. Young men in many countries now see marriage and divorce as so toxic for men that some 70% of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity. And if the gender laws are not soon made men fair, then probably within a decade that percentage will be over 90%, which will wipe out whole populations within a generation, which is a likelihood so dire that this situation has to be stopped. Another branch of the men's lib movement are the masculists, who are a lot more political, aggressive, and ideologically confrontational than the apolitical, wimpy MGTOWs, who simply passively, quietly walk away from marriage and paternity. MGTOWs, unlike the masculists, are not fighters. The masculists label them apolitical wimps. The masculists see the bigger picture and aim to fundamentally change the gender roles of society so that the above fluffy feminist toxicity of the divorce courts can be overcome. The masculists aim to create a FIP society, that's in capital letters, in which both sexes are socialized by parents and educated by teachers and professors to be FIPs, to be emo, that's EMO, FIPs, that is, FIPs who feel equally morally obliged to be FIPs and not expect fluffy style to be able to parasite off the labour and money of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime in the eyes of the masculists. The masculists argue that with nearly all women being FIPs, a divorcing mother can then afford to half raise her kids while sharing the custody of the kids equally, by law, by default, with the divorced father, the divorced husband. Masculists have a hatred against monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, seeing them as indirect genociders, since indirectly they are wiping out whole populations, since they have made the divorce courts so toxic for men that, not surprisingly, the large majority of young men today reject marriage and paternity as institutions that only fools and ignorami accept. Red-pilled men, that is, those who know of MGTOW and masculinist ideas, avoid marriage and paternity like the plague because they utterly reject the risk of 1 chance in 4 of being financially crucified by the hated monoconscious fluffy feminists in the divorce courts. So they live the MGTOW lifestyle, and if they are also masculists, they fight to men fair the gender laws. Masculists are not only hateful towards the monoconscious control of the divorce courts, but push for the general men fairing of society, especially with the legislation of the para, that's paternity rejection right, which masculists see as the fundamental historical equivalent for men, as was the fight of the suffragettes for the right to vote for women. The fact that women have the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, that is the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, that if continued would ruin her life, but men don't have the para, is the most blatant form of sexist discrimination that exists. One of the major reasons why masculists push so hard for the fipping of women is that a fit woman, a fit mother, is in a much stronger financial position to pay the full cost of a kid if she gets sole custody, or to pay for half of the cost of a kid if she gets joint custody. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to fip up, using the slogan, quote, "Women have a career window of half a century, so must fip up, or be punished by men by not getting one," end quote. Which is a very powerful moral argument that even most women find difficult to refute. Masculists see fluffy feminists as hypocrites, since these feminists want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but behave as fluffies in the divorce courts. That is, they want equal rights with men, but reject equal obligations with men by not sharing equally the burden of earning the living, by not bothering to fip up at high school and college, by not bothering to get a career-competent education, so that these career-incompetent, uneducated women cannot be real fips as adults, and hence will expect, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. So to masculists, monoconscious, fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts are both hypocrites and genociders, so have to be stopped. How to stop them? One way is with bullets in a sex war, by assassinating the gender politicians who made these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place. In brackets, for example, in the divorce courts, no para, etc. By murdering thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges. And if the sex war really heats up, by going out into the streets and simply shooting millions of fluffy feminists, that is feminazis, who have been so brainwashed by monoconscious feminism, taught that men are the oppressors, that women are the oppressed, and that gender oppression is a one-way street. That they have turned into misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitches, utterly repulsive